My wife, Lynn, and I had been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our relationship had always been very normal, without any weird behaviors or red flags. This made the whole situation even more out of character for her. Lynn is kind, intelligent, and thoughtful, not the type to be childish or to scare me. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she tried watching The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror, but she was so scared that we had to turn it off halfway through. Creepy things and pranks have never been her cup of tea. She never had any mental health issues, and as far as I know, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people can hide their mental health problems, but in 6 years, I think I'd have noticed some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was making coffee in the kitchen before work. Running late, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop by Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. As I sipped my coffee and hurried down the hall towards the front door, I noticed Lynn peeking at me from around the corner. Only her eyes and a strand of her long, dark hair were visible. The rest of her body was hidden. I nearly spilled my coffee in surprise, burning my lips in the process. "Geez, Lynn," I said, wiping coffee off my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately disappeared from view, like a little kid caught doing something they shouldn't. I heard her scurry off towards the living room. By the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird and totally out of character for her, but I found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and less serious. I shouted that I loved her and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was odd, but not alarming. I forgot about it by lunchtime, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. Neither of us mentioned it, and life went on. 3 days later, around 2 a.m., I woke up to get a drink. Standing at the kitchen island with a jug of orange juice in hand, I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I looked down and saw Lynn's smiling face peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed not out of irritation but out of fear. Lynn scuttled backward out of view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I just stood there, frozen in shock, wondering what had possessed her to do that. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I watched her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I started to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee. After handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I wouldn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was talking about. "You were peeking at me again." "From over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze and then burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. "You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that?" I said. She giggled, set her cup on the counter, and wrapped her arms around my neck. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that, and the sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It wasn't like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once, she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk at the foot of our bed. I might not have known she was there at all if the trunk's old hinges hadn't given her away. She had the lid propped up just enough for only half of her face to peek through, grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why she was doing this. She didn't answer. She just slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, Maybe I've just gotten better at it. I didn't say anything, but I wondered if she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking, and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking to see if she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumping whenever I was home, and she wasn't in full view. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls, convincing myself it was just a bad memory. Then, a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn had left to go to a friend's, and I found myself sprawled on the couch, diving into a few games on my laptop. The evening ticked by, and around 9 p.m., I decided it was time for a shower. As I rinsed the soap from my hair, I suddenly felt that unsettling sensation of being watched. Hesitantly, I opened my eyes, and I nearly had a heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head thrust into the shower while her body remained outside. Her long, dark hair hung against the curtain, dripping water, and her mouth stretched into a ghastly grin. Her eyes were wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in hours. I screamed and stumbled back against the wall, but she didn't move or lose that terrible smile. Her makeup had run down her cheeks in 2 black streaks, giving her a deranged look that filled me with pure terror. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she slowly withdrew her head from the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the door slammed shut with such force that it rattled the mirror. I screamed again, leaping out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed in the bathroom for over an hour, pacing and stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Maybe I overreacted, but joke or not, I wasn't putting up with this crazy shit anymore. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound. Pressing my ear against the door, I strained to listen but couldn't hear anything. I imagined Lynn standing on the other side, giggling at her joke. A surge of anger washed over me. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house and hiding in the bathroom for over an hour. What kind of joke was this? What the fuck, Lynn? I snapped. This sh*t is getting really fucking annoying. I waited for her to apologize or call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, followed by complete silence. Lynn, I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just my own heavy breathing. I swear to God, just fucking stop it, I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. But there was nothing, only the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes, which felt like a lifetime. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully, I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but not Lynn. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more worried. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, mentally preparing myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me nauseous to think about. A moan, louder than before, and this time I could tell where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door in slow motion and locked eyes with my wife, peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were as wide as ever, and her mouth hung open in the most grotesque grin I'd ever seen. I didn't scream. I was too scared for that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, her body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow, I found the ability to yank the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could down the steps, grabbing my keys and phone from the living room table before bolting outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering from either fear or the cold, maybe both. I was still in my boxers, my hair damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring any call or text that came through. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially in just a pair of boxers, but they told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked what happened, I told him Lynn and I had a fight, but didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting and leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. For years, I had encouraged her to lighten up instead of being so serious. I wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She'd never left the bathroom at all, instead slipping into the closet and slamming the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill so I could get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling faces. I woke up just as the sun started to rise, my sore body aching from the sofa. I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say. I wouldn't go home unless she promised never to do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her when that familiar feeling came over me. I was being watched. Staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me it was quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid. Anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now." She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife, Rebecca, hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there were the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Probably an animal, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain. I called out of work that day and turned off my cell. I couldn't face Lynn. Just the thought of talking to her was too much for me at that point. I had started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. No matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront her, to give her one last chance to explain herself. After 6 years, I felt I owed her that much. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. "Can we talk? I love you, please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And more of the same. All texts told me she loved me and wanted me home, how worried she was. Not a single one addressed the crazy sh*t she pulled. It was like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from this situation. But if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all 4s like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up until afternoon yesterday, and thankfully, I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. "But is this fight something that can be mended?" Rebecca asked. She'd made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. "I don't know. She's like a different person," I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I had been dealing with. "People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed," she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung my heart. I missed and loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very unlike Lynn, I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, and my mouth suddenly dried. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her, it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Deck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No, she just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. I just said to let you sleep, she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No. She looked awful, though. She hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better knowing that, at least, she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I sworn an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly, she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police. And besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she'd been, she still hadn't committed any crimes. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably say that I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous even. Something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew that, as her husband, I was well within my rights to have her committed. But what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want it, believe me. Her mother, Marion, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I gritted my teeth and did what I had to. Yes, she answered, already sounding irritated. Marion, it's me. Ben, do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said it coolly. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling. Benjamin, what is it that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues, I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if it is, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, she began, but I cut her off before she could dismiss me. Marion, this isn't a joke. I'm genuinely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been extremely erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I thought, as her mother, you would be too, I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason, I was desperate not to let her. I had a gut feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. Please, Marion, if not for me, do it for Lynn, I pleaded. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she was struggling to maintain her steely persona but failing. Marion, what's wrong? I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I replayed the conversation in my mind, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She said those words with urgency. It wasn't just my imagination. Her voice had changed slightly when she said that, as if they were crucial. What did she mean? I assumed she was talking about medical professionals, but perhaps she meant someone else, someone she didn't feel comfortable naming directly. Or maybe I was just grasping at straws. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't disclose everything. I wasn't ready to explain it all yet, but I did tell them about our last encounter and how she had hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were visibly shocked, but thankfully, they believed me. They wanted to help her too, although they didn't see it as severe. Strange, maybe, but not dangerous. They kept suggesting that Lynn might be playing some kind of bizarre joke. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca offered, though she was not entirely convinced. Chris advised against involving the police just yet. Instead, he suggested we go together, reasoning that calmly talking to her and coaxing her to seek help willingly was the best approach. I agreed to his plan. At least I wouldn't be facing this alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach churned. Her car wasn't there, but I remained on edge. The front door stood ajar, and for a moment, I feared I might see her eyes staring back through the gap. I trembled, beginning to sweat. Chris, however, seemed unfazed. He waited for me to open the door, hands in pockets, appearing as relaxed as if he were strolling through a park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and immediately recoiled at the stench of rot. Chris wrinkled his nose in agreement as he entered the house behind me. What do they use to clean the floors around here? Crap? Chris muttered. Shut up, I snapped, scanning the dimly lit, eerily quiet house. Despite it being 10 in the morning, all the curtains were tightly drawn, keeping sunlight at bay. If I hadn't left just 2 days ago, I might have thought the house abandoned. We searched each room methodically, checking every possible hiding spot and calling out Lynn's name intermittently. Why are you checking under the couch? Chris eventually asked. Aren't we looking for your wife? He regarded me with a puzzled look. Let's just go upstairs, I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn's and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church and after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. I don't think she's here. Ben, why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something, Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom, where I shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all the color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals, wondered how she'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs. Chris was gagging. Ben, I think we should go, he called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. Who lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs an exorcist. He said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell anymore. His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound was in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving, to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said it softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide, open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and I immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, her fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. Are you all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding? Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. Chris, run. Go, I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because, a second later, I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. Jesus, Lynn, Chris said. You, playing hide and seek? I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. Move your things, Chris, I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed my head in fast, sharp motions, trying to process the scene unfolding before me. Lynn, my wife, grinned unnervingly, her mouth stretching wider and wider until it seemed impossible. Chris muttered a prayer and bolted down the stairs. I stood frozen at the top, torn between my love for Lynn and my instinct to protect myself. "I only want to help," I managed to say, my voice trembling as I fought back tears. Lynn's gaze locked onto me, her eyes piercing as she slowly lifted a glass, extending it towards me. And then she charged, sprinting with manic excitement. Instinctively, I flew down the stairs, taking them two at a time, reaching the front door just as she leapt onto my back. Her arms tightened around my neck, her breath hot against my ear, and the hiccuping sounds unsettlingly close. With a surge of adrenaline, I shook her off, feeling a sharp pain in my back as she fell. I flung open the door and raced to my car. Outside, Chris was on the phone with 911, his voice urgent. I didn't utter a word as I sprinted to my car, Chris following suit. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see Lynn chasing us, but the street was empty. Relief washed over me momentarily. At the I received stitches for the wounds on my arm and back. The police arrived, questioning me extensively before searching the house. Lynn was nowhere to be found. They advised me to stay elsewhere and file a restraining order, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. I dropped Chris off and drove an hour to a motel, needing distance from Lynn. It's been 4 hours since then, and I'm still shaken. I hoped the police would find her and get her the help she desperately needed. But hope faded when I received a text 40 minutes ago from an unknown number. "I found you." Attached was a dark, grainy picture. I recognized it instantly, the unmistakable eye of my wife. I'm writing this now, my hand shaking. I'm alone, scared, and overwhelmed by the feeling of being watched. Feeling of being watched. Feeling of being watched. Feeling of being watched.